Hello, I'm Philip Chase. Welcome to my YouTube channel on the best of fantasy. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody who has subscribed to my channel so far. I'm very grateful for that and for all the wonderful comments you guys have been leaving. I've been enjoying interacting with you and being part of a community built around fantasy. And I started this channel to celebrate fantasy and to create discussions around the topic of, well, what's great about fantasy? So I thought it would be appropriate to do a video on texts that I consider to be foundational for fantasy as a window into the genre and its origins. These are texts that actually precede the origin of fantasy as a conscious genre, which happened in the 19th century. I'll perhaps do a video on that someday. But these texts are far, far older than that for the most part. They derive from, in many cases, oral tradition. They are, in some cases, religious texts. They are myths. They are folk tales. They are epics. And they all have elements that are very common to fantasy. So, without further ado, let me give you my list of books that I consider to be really wonderful reads if you are a lover of fantasy. And especially if you're an aspiring fantasy writer. I would venture to guess that many of your favorite fantasy writers have actually read many of these books and been very much inspired by them. So, without further ado, let's get into my first pick. These are not ranked, by the way, in any sort of way. Just a list of books that I consider to be really wonderful foundational classics for people who love fantasy. So, number one is the Mahabharata. And I'm aware that there's an A on the end of that word. I'm just pronouncing it the way I hear it, having lived in South Asia for a little bit and traveled there. The way that most people, modern people, at least as I understand it, pronounce it is Mahabharata. But at any rate, I'm not claiming to be an expert on that, so please do weigh in if you have a preferred pronunciation. At any rate, the Mahabharata, what is it? It is the biggest epic ever, period. There is nothing bigger than this. It is the official version is like 18 volumes long, and that makes it about 10 times longer than the Iliad and the Odyssey put together. And it is the story of the War of Kurukshetra, which is a dynastic battle that took place some thousands of years ago between the Pandav brothers on the one side and all of their followers, various kingdoms and tribes, and then you have the Kaurav brothers, 100 of them on the other side. This is truly epic stuff. And because the Pandav brothers and the Kaurav brothers are actually cousins, this conflict involves all kinds of sacrifices and conflicts of interest and just really tragic events. So it is impossible to summarize this, but it is truly magnificent. And it also is important to mention that it is part of a living and breathing tradition. Unlike the other entries on this list, with the exception of the Ramayana, this is part of an actual organic tradition that is part of a religion, Hinduism. So that is important as well to mention and be respectful of that. But at any rate, yes, I believe that the Mahabharata is one of the greatest. I haven't read all 18 volumes myself. I've read there are various versions of this. As I said, it's a living story. So you'll find many, many versions, as well as movies and television series and one very important episode as well. The most famous episode perhaps from the Mahabharata is the Bhagavad Gita, which is a part of the story where Krishna, who is serving as the charioteer for Arjun, basically gives a divine epiphany to Arjun, who is lamenting and has basically stopped in the midst of the battle because he is so sorrowful about the losses and many of the people who are his relations and mentors and friends on the other side. And it is just a magnificent episode, which you will find many, many versions of both the Mahabharata as a whole and the Bhagavad Gita as an episode. Just really beautiful stuff. I mentioned the Ramayana as well. That is another important religious epic in South Asia, and that is the story of Ram and his wife Sita and her abduction by Ravan and her recovery with help from Hanuman. And it is just, it's a narrower in scope in the sense that the Mahabharata is just huge and broad, but the Ramayana is actually the older of the two. Both magnificent reading and just huge in scale. But as I said, you can find many different versions. We even have a couple graphic novel type versions. Here's the Mahabharata and the Ramayana that we bought for our kids, and well, I read them too. So just really wonderful stuff. Time to move on. I mentioned the Iliad and the Odyssey. Well, those are next on my list. And these are, of course, most of you will know, these were attributed to Homer. Here's the Iliad, here's the Odyssey. I have the Lattimore translations. I don't know Sanskrit, and I don't know ancient Greek either, unfortunately. So I do rely on translations for these. But these are the stories, of course, of the Trojan War, in the case of the Iliad, with Achilles being kind of the central hero there. And, of course, the Odyssey is centered around the character of Odysseus on his way home from the Trojan War, which is another kind of huge journey as he tries to get home with some of the gods opposed to him and some helping him. It takes him another 10 years to get home after being at war for 10 years. So really just classic stuff. Many of our favorite authors are most definitely inspired by this. One that comes to mind for me is Stephen Erickson, where the influence from these classic epics is pretty apparent. Another one in a similar vein, although it's a much more conscious literary effort, is the Aeneid by Virgil. Now, this was in Latin. And this is a kind of a conscious imitation of the older Greek epics, but it's the story, it is kind of loosely connected to them as well, because it's the story of Aeneas, who escapes from Troy and goes on to found, well, Rome, according to the tradition. So another great one to add to the list. Next, I would like to throw out to you Beowulf, a personal favorite of mine. Now, this is one I can read in the original, in the Old English. I have various editions of this. I've got my classic Kleber, and I've also got some more modern editions. These are in Old English. This is the Mitchell Robinson edition. And I've got a recommendation for anyone who wants to read a translation, which would be most people. Probably the Seamus Heaney translation would be my favorite, and you can find that in various formats. This is a Norton Critical edition with some nice little essays in there as well. So Beowulf, and I think Tolkien, of course, to give an obvious example of a fantasy writer who was inspired by Beowulf, he also is a scholar, of course, and he wrote about Beowulf being a lament more than an epic. And I think he was absolutely correct in that. A lament for the past, looking back at a past way of life that is gone. So some really beautiful stuff in there, some really lyrical stuff in Beowulf. Next on my list, the Eddas. So we're sticking with sort of the Germanic theme here. And I have various versions of the Eddas here, and we need to make the distinction between the Prose Edda, which is attributed to Snorri Sturluson, and the Poetic Edda, which is a collection of anonymous poems that tap into ancient Germanic mythology. So you've got, I've had these various editions here, which are in Old Norse. Probably most people would want to get for the Prose Edda, the Anthony Fawkes. Let's see here, I have it somewhere here. Yes, here it is. The translation by Anthony Fawkes, which is really quite good. He's a very great scholar of Old Norse. And this was, by the way, Snorri wrote this as a guide to understand the old myths and to help poets to understand the kennings and the various references to the old myths in poetry. He was writing this in the early 1200s. And so that was a time when, after a couple hundred years of Christianity, some of the old myths were beginning to be forgotten. So he wrote this as a kind of a helpful tips, reminder for poets to remember what they were using as reference points. Really good stuff, and I would recommend reading this, the Prose Edda, before tackling the Poetic Edda, which is, I have a translation of that here. I have it in the original Old Norse here behind me as well, the Eddu Kvaði, or the Poetic Edda. I have the Hollander translation, which is really, I think, quite good. But these are really old poems, and it'll help you if you read the Prose Edda first, because Sturluson really helps to explain what these kind of obscure, otherwise obscure poems might be about. And so this is really good stuff, from creation to stories of the gods to some stories of the heroes, such as Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. Speaking of Sigurd, the next one on my list is the Volsungs Saga, the Saga of the Volsungs. I have a translation of that here. This is the story of the Volsungs are like, especially Sigurd and his father Sigmund, are the kind of the most famous heroes of Germanic legend, if you will. And it's a really beautiful, beautiful story that was obviously at one time immensely popular, because there are various versions of their allusions to it in Beowulf. There's the sagas itself. There's even a version of the story in Middle High German called the Niebelungenlied, which is also, I would say, another one I would throw out there as a recommendation. But yeah, the Volsungs Saga, and this is the story of Sigurd and the Dragon Slayer, Slayer of Fafnir, who goes on to win the great treasure, but also it's cursed. This treasure is cursed, so some of these themes will sound very familiar to fantasy fans. But anyway, in addition to the saga of the Volsungs, really, Iceland was a place in medieval times that produced a number of just immensely wonderful sagas and stories. So I'd recommend lots of them, but for now we'll stick to this one. All right, well, next on the list, after the Volsung Saga, I'm going to go to the more the Celtic-speaking countries. How about the Mabinogion? Here it is, the Mabinogion. This is a translation that I have, probably, I think, one of the most respected translations by Gwyn Jones and Thomas Jones. And these are Welsh stories. Some of them are Arthurian, but they're really old Arthurian stories before the French got a hold of the Arthurian stories and made them all chivalrous. This is kind of what King Arthur stories looked like. There are other stories that have references to entities who were probably gods at one point and were demoted after the coming of Christianity. So you have mythological stories. It's a collection of various tales that most of them are somewhere around, I think, the 11th, 12th century or so, that they were compiled, but they're actually much older stories that were circulating in oral tradition for a long time. So really great stuff. If you like the Celtic stuff too, there's a lot of good Irish stories. So you have, there are the invasion myths, the various peoples and entities that came to Ireland, and there's the Ulster cycle, and there's also the Fenian cycle, and there are then later stories of various kings and heroes and legends. But yeah, there's really a broad array of Irish myths and sagas. This is a nice little book that I have that compiles some of them. It gives you a little taste, really. It's translated by Geoffrey Gans, another good respected translator and scholar. So that's all good stuff too, really, the Celtic stuff. And if you like the Arthurian stuff, really there's this broad array. Some of my favorites, though, one would be the Lais of Marie de France. These are just lovely lyrical, really magical poems, and she claims to have been inspired by the Breton singers, and so they were her source material. And she gives a really nice spin on some of the Arthurian stories. A lot of fairies and elvish kind of stuff in here. And then there's also perhaps one of my favorite Arthurian stories, which would be Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And I have an edition here. Most people would much prefer to read a modern translation. But this is a really wonderful Arthurian story. There's magic in there, and it's the most self-conscious Arthurian story from the Middle Ages, in the sense that it kind of pokes fun at itself and at the main character. So really introspective, really beautiful, magical stuff here. If you like the Arthurian material, I would recommend Sir Gawain and the Green Knight from the 14th century. Next on my list, I'm going to go somewhere a little different. How about the 1001 Nights, which is this my version here is kind of old and it says Tales from the Arabian Nights, but it's from the 1001 Nights, the collection of folk tales and stories that are falling under this big umbrella where there's this frame narrative, maybe one of the most framed narratives ever, of Scheherazade, the bride of the king who keeps killing every wife. I guess his first wife cheated on him, and from there on he married a bunch of virgins that he would kill the next morning. And to avoid that fate, Scheherazade told a story every night. And would leave at a crucial point, would stop telling the story, and so the king would have to let her live in order to hear the end of the story. So lots of very, very old tales collected under this umbrella, and they go back to India and Persia and all over the Arab world. So really, really epic, wonderful stuff in here. So highly recommend that. And next on my list of great classics to read, if you love fantasy, I'd like to throw out some Shakespeare. Why not? There are two plays that Shakespeare did not take the plot from somewhere else. In other words, every plot for every play Shakespeare wrote was taken from somewhere else, except for two. And of these two, these are the most fantasy-like. And they include A Midsummer Night's Dream and The Tempest. So they have fairies in them, and they have various fantasy elements. So yeah, some good stuff for fantasy lovers to check out with Shakespeare. Another great classic, Milton's Paradise Lost. Okay, so this is the epic Milton's answer to the ancient Greek epics, and the Aeneid was Paradise Lost, which was based, of course, on the biblical story of Genesis. But the most famous character, the original anti-hero, if you will, is Satan. And I'm not sure that Milton really intended for that to be the case, but as the postmodernists say, the author is dead. In Milton's case, he's been dead a very long time. So Satan is, he's a fascinating character who is epic in the beginning. He's vast, and he's a great warrior, and he weeps for his followers as they're laid low in the flaming pit of hell. And he shows at times kind of remorse, and he's just an amazing character. He's the most complex villain from these older stories that you'll ever see. Yeah, if you want to see a really complex villain who goes way back, read Milton's Paradise Lost. Check out his version of Satan. You'll be amazed. It's really amazing stuff. Last on my list is the Kalevala, the sort of the national story, if you will, of Finland. And actually, this was a collection of stories. A fellow named Elias Lönnrot, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name, went around and, with I think some help, collected a bunch of folk tales and stories from Finland and Karelia, and sort of compiled them together into this really important epic, if you will. It tells the story of creation, the adventures of Vainamoinen and Ilmarinen and other really great characters. Again, sorry for the pronunciation. But really important text also for just for Finland, for its national identity, as many of these are important texts in terms of national identity. So there you have it. There's my list of really great classic stories, epics, myths, religious tales, you name it, that if you're a lover of fantasy, you really should check some of these out. They will enrich your reading of fantasy, and they are, in and of themselves, very worthy of reading. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I will return to discussing some great fantasy, contemporary fantasy, next week. So I hope you'll join me for that. And thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy fantasy and you'd like to see more of this kind of content. Till next time.